Today's documentary, Amazing Grace, the Unlikely Abolitionist. The sea does not forgive. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 10th, 1748, the Atlantic Ocean proved it. A storm, relentless and roaring, had pursued the slave ship Greyhound for over a week. Now it had her. Wind screamed through shredded rigging. Waves, like moving mountains, slammed into the wooden hull, threatening to splinter it into kindling. In his cabin, a 22-year-old man clung to anything solid. His name was John Newton, and he was the captain of this vessel. But in this moment, he was not a commander. He was a terrified soul, certain the next wave would be his coffin. For 11 hours, he worked the pumps alongside his exhausted, terrified crew. And then, a brutal blow. A wall of water crashed over the deck, sweeping a man overboard and smashing into the side of the ship with such force that a gaping hole was torn open. As seawater poured into the hold, Newton uttered words he had not spoken in years, words born of a childhood faith long since abandoned. "Lord, have mercy upon us." It was a desperate plea, thrown into the gale. He did not expect an answer. But that night, in the teeth of the storm, began one of history's most profound and improbable transformations. To understand the magnitude of that change, we must first meet the man John Newton was before the storm. He was born in London on July 24th, 1725, to a devout Puritan mother, Elizabeth, who dreamed her son would become a minister. She filled his young mind with scripture in him. But she died of tuberculosis when John was just 6 years old, a loss that would haunt him forever. His father, a stern, ambitious sea captain named John Newton Sr., had different plans. At age 11, John was sent to sea on his father's ship. The Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the North Atlantic. These became his classrooms. He learned navigation, discipline, and a hardened, cynical view of the world. By 17, he was press-ganged into service on a British man-of-war, HMS Harwich. He despised it, attempted desertion, was publicly flogged, and was degraded to a common seaman. Humiliated and angry, he saw his chance to escape when his ship docked in West Africa. He arranged a transfer to a slave-trading vessel bound for the coast. From 1743 to 1745, John Newton found himself not as a sailor, but as a servant, almost a slave himself, to a slave trader named Amos Clow on the Plantain Islands off Sierra Leone. Clow's African wife, Princess Pay, took a violent dislike to the young Englishman. Newton was starved, abused, and treated with contempt, forced to grovel for scraps of food. This was a crucial, ironic twist. The future abolitionist first experienced the degradation of being treated as less than human. In early 1747, his father managed to secure his release. A ship called the Greyhound, homeward bound from Africa, picked him up. And here, fate took another turn. The Greyhound was not a slaver. It was a trading ship carrying beeswax and wood. But Newton's past was not so easily shed. On board, he proved a disruptive influence, mocking religious crew members and living with a notorious profanity that shocked even veteran sailors. He was a man adrift in every sense, morally bankrupt and spiritually empty. This was the man who, a year later, would find himself commanding that very ship, the Greyhound, on another voyage. The storm passed. The Greyhound, though crippled, somehow stayed afloat and limped into the port of Loch Swilly in Ireland. For John Newton, the physical danger had subsided, but a profound internal tempest had just begun. He could not shake the memory of his prayer in the storm. Was it merely a coward's cry, or was it answered? He began to read the Bible he had once mocked. He devoured Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. A spiritual awakening, slow and tentative, took root. But here is the first, great, and disturbing contradiction of Newton's story. His conversion did not immediately lead him to renounce the slave trade. In fact, he saw his survival and subsequent good fortune as divine providence guiding him back to the very business that had enslaved him. We must board one of these ships with him to understand the cognitive dissonance that would later fuel his remorse. The standard Middle Passage voyage was a meticulously planned atrocity. Newton's logs from the African in 1752 to 53 are chillingly precise. He records the purchase of 87 enslaved men, women, and children at the Company of Merchants Trading Fort on Sherbro Island. He writes of putting down a rebellion with brutal force. And yet, in the same journal, he writes pious reflections and leads Sunday services for his crew. He even fell in love and married a woman named Mary Catlett during a shore leave, writing her passionate letters that spoke of God's grace, even as his ship carried human beings in chains. The tension was unsustainable. In 1754, on his final voyage, he suffered a severe stroke. His health broken, he never went to sea again. It was the end of his career as a slaver, but only the beginning of his battle with its legacy. Ashore in Liverpool, a bustling port built on the profits of human bondage, Newton took a position as a tide surveyor, a customs official. But the quiet, settled life allowed his conscience to stir. He began to study theology with a ferocious intensity. Finally, in 1764, at the age of 39, he was ordained and given the small, rural parish of Olney in Buckinghamshire. Here, in this quiet village, John Newton found his voice. His preaching, fueled by his dramatic testimony of grace, drew huge crowds. He began a remarkable collaboration with the poet William Cowper. Together, they published the Olney Hymns in 1779. It was for this collection that Newton penned a hymn based on his own life story. In 1780, Newton accepted a prestigious post as rector of St. Mary Woolnoth in London. The city was the epicenter of political power, and Newton's pulpit became a platform. It was here, in 1785, that a young, deeply troubled member of Parliament named William Wilberforce came to see him. Newton's counsel was decisive. It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation. For years, he had privately anguished over his past. Now, the growing abolition movement gave him a path to atone. In 1788, Newton delivered a weapon of immense moral force, a searing, first-hand account published as Thoughts upon the Slave Trade. He testified before parliamentary committees, his aged frame and earnest demeanor making his words impossible to dismiss. The political fight was slow. The first abolition bill failed. The second failed. John Newton, now 81 years old, frail and nearly blind, lived just long enough to see the tide turn. On March 25, 1807, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act received royal assent. It was a monumental victory, outlawing the trade throughout the British Empire. The hymn he wrote in a quiet Olney study took on a life of its own. Amazing Grace traveled and became a universal hymn of hope.